This video is on the 7 stages of process, otherwise known as the 7-stage continuum, or just the 7 stages if you prefer. The 7 stages is, I would say, a measuring tool that Rogers developed to try and gauge how in touch with a person's organism they are. On the one hand, at stage 1, theoretically a person is completely out of touch with their organism and they have had to reduce the world, let's say, the complexity of the world and their own feelings to very rigid, fixed judgments in order to cope, because there's so much uncertainty in here and they don't have any kind of trust in their own feelings in order to guide them. They have to build up a very rigid and structured view of the world in order to cope with that. So that's stage 1, and right up to stage 7, where a person's completely in touch with their organism. Personally, I think everyone's somewhere in between. I don't know if anyone's 0% or if anyone's 100%, but it's a concept that acts as a measuring tool that can be helpful in that way.
Rogers describes 7 distinct stages, but ultimately I think it's more of a gradual continuum. Personally, I find the distinctions between the different stages to be a little bit arbitrary, a little bit not random, but there could be 6 stages, could be 8 stages, could be 50. He described it as 7 stages, I think mainly to make it easier to describe, essentially. He acknowledges this in his book as well. So basically, you don't need to get hung up on what's happening in each stage. I will describe them because that's how it is often described, but just see it as a measuring tool to look at how in touch with a person's organism they are. And it explains the kinds of characteristics that might be presented in people on one side of the spectrum and how they might develop certain characteristics that might emerge as they get more in touch with themselves. Rogers talks most famously about the 7 stages in his book On Becoming a Person, and this is a quote which in any lesson, in most videos you'll find about the 7 stages, you'll probably see this quote pop up. He says, "Individuals move not from a fixity or homeostasis through change to a new fixity, though such a process is indeed possible, but much the more significant continuum is from fixity to changingness, from rigid structure to flow, from stasis to process." What he means here is that as someone goes through the continuum, they don't go from one fixed way of being to another fixed way of being. It is characterized more by a loosening of ideas about yourself, about the world, a flexibility, an openness, a fluidity. So these are the characteristics we would associate with stage 1. This is a person who's completely out of touch with their organism, and as a result they have a very rigid self-concept and very rigid ideas about how the world works. I would say their self-concept and their ideas about how the world works is characterized by a desperate need for certainty and a cutting out of complexity and any kind of uncertainty, both in who they are and their own feelings and in the world itself. So, for example, they don't tend to communicate themselves. They only talk about things out there. They don't say, I think, I believe, I feel. They make lots of judgments, perhaps, about the world, and they don't acknowledge that they are judgments. Their attitude is, it's just true. It's just true. So their worldview will be made up of lots of huge judgments. Students are lazy. These people are like that. But it's not I believe students are lazy. You won't be able to get them to acknowledge that students are lazy is even open to debate. They are lazy. Students are lazy. There's just no way for them to cope with the uncertainty that will arise from acknowledging that that is simply their perspective and that maybe some students aren't lazy. They can't do it. Another characteristic of stage 1 is seeing themselves as having no problems, or at least seeing any problems that they do acknowledge as being completely external to them, like students being lazy, for example. This stage is characterized by those kinds of statements making up their worldview, and their worldview never changing regardless of any evidence to the contrary or evidence that it's not as simple as that. These kinds of statements and judgments that they make may well not even be about truth. It's about comfort and safety and security. And for that reason, they may well see themselves as having no problems whatsoever. Any problems are out there, if they acknowledge any problems in life at all. And also any really genuinely vulnerable, close, communicative relations are regarded as dangerous. So they might have relationships, but probably quite surface level, controllable, not too much spontaneity or talking about feelings or anything like that, because it's too dangerous. It's not safe enough. On to stage 2 now, and there's a slight opening up of experience between stage 1 and stage 2. The person might still be quite closed off in stage 2, but they're slightly more open to what's going on. So, for example, they can express feelings about things that at least don't relate to themselves. Maybe in this case, I think students are lazy. They may well still make crude and global judgments about the world, but at least here they're more inclined to acknowledge that they are judgments and that it is their perspective. That doesn't mean they're likely to ever change their mind, even with huge amounts of evidence to the contrary, or acknowledge that perhaps they're generalising a bit, but at least there is some reference to the I here. They might also be able to acknowledge here that they have some problems, although they're not usually likely to express it in a way that takes any personal responsibility for them. For example, disorganisation always crops up in my life is the example that Rogers uses in his book. The way it's expressed is almost as if disorganisation comes out of the sky and hits them, and it's completely a random event, which is a way of looking at it, I suppose, whereby they don't have to think about why that happens or if there's anything they can do about it. Also emerging in stage 2 is some kind of ability to relate to one's own feelings, although doing so in a very indirect way. The example Rogers uses is someone in therapy being asked why they're there, and them saying the symptoms were just very depressed. And they'll relate to the feelings like that, like from afar, with a real sense of distance, almost as an object that someone else has observed rather than something that they're experiencing directly. They won't say, I am depressed, and they certainly won't go into the perhaps uncomfortable and difficult feelings that make up what depressed actually means. And finally, another characteristic is that they will refer to themselves now, certainly more than in stage 1. However, they'll make these same global judgments like they did earlier about the world at large. They now make them about themselves. They refer to themselves in a very fixed, absolute way. So, for example, I'm useless, I can't do anything right. And that's not just an expression of frustration in the moment, that's really how they see themselves. Before going on to stage 3, I just want to mention that Rogers felt that what prompts movement along this continuum is feeling really heard and really accepted wherever it is that you're at. That's what enables a person to feel safe enough to start peeling back the layers of their own experience and start being able to acknowledge these more uncertain and perhaps uncomfortable feelings. Probably also worth mentioning that Rogers felt that people in stage 1 are unlikely to come for therapy, mainly because, well, they don't see the point in talking about feelings and also don't acknowledge that they have any, whilst people in stage 2 may well be able to acknowledge feelings but may be so rigid and fixed in their attitude towards themselves that they don't see the point in talking about them. On to stage 3 then, and there's a further opening up, a loosening of a person's concepts and ideas about themselves, and they're able to express themselves quite openly actually about feelings and meanings from the past. So for example, they'll tell a story about maybe something that happened to them when they were a child, and they'll talk about how they felt back then and how that was for them back then. They'll only be able to talk about it in terms of feelings back then rather than how they're feeling now, thinking about it. And there'll be a freer flow of expression about themselves generally, but it'll generally be about themselves as an object in relation to others. And the way they'll talk is about what kind of object they are. I'm like this, I'm like that. I try to be like this, I try to be like that. And they're able to talk a lot more about themselves now in more detail, but they're doing so in a way that suggests that they see themselves still as an object, as fixed, and maybe they see therapy as a way of working out what kind of object they are. I suppose there's a certain level of abstraction to how they might talk about feelings. I get angry, I like this, I don't like that, I feel sad sometimes, I don't get happy. So there's talk about feelings now, but it's almost with a sense of holding themselves up from afar and observing from afar what kind of object they are, what kind of characteristics they can observe in this thing over there that they're talking about. So there's a sense of distance to it. There can be a real self-consciousness now as well, because they're talking about feelings, even if they are a bit distant, they're talking about feelings in some depth, and they can be very conscious of the judgments that people might make about those feelings or about what kind of object they are. So there can be a real wanting to check out if how they're feeling is normal, or perhaps justifying how they're feeling. I felt angry, but you would do, wouldn't you? Personal constructs are still rigid, but they are sometimes acknowledged as constructs. So for example, I can't do anything right. It could be expressed as, I feel like I can't do anything right. I really hate feeling that way. So they're able to acknowledge it and maybe still feel rigid in that way, but they can step back and observe their own feelings and the fact that it's not an objective fact, that it is a feeling, and even have feelings about those feelings. And alongside all this, as they're opening up a little bit to their own experience and their own feelings, they may be able to acknowledge that some problems don't just come at random, don't just come out of the sky, and they're not entirely passive. They can acknowledge some level of responsibility, if not for the problems themselves, but perhaps in how they deal with and react to them. Moving into stage 4, and feelings that have been experienced in the past can be talked about with real intensity and depth now, whilst feelings as they arise in the moment can be expressed, but with a real tentativeness, with a real distrust and discomfort about them. It's almost as though a person needs to wait until they fully understand what the feeling is before it can be expressed. For things in the past, it can feel more safe, whereas in the moment, if a feeling just pops up and it's right at the edge of your awareness and you're not really sure you understand it or even know what it is, that can be a very dangerous and scary thing to do. Nevertheless, that is starting to happen a little bit in stage 4. To the extent that those feelings are coming up in the present moment, though, there's a real feeling that they shouldn't be, and a real discomfort and a real preference for them not to exist and not to come up at all. There's almost a sense of inappropriateness around letting feelings come up in the moment, a strong preference for talking about them from afar in a detached kind of way rather than really experiencing them head on. And alongside all this, and probably to do with all these other things I've already talked about, is the idea that of the person becoming more aware of the fact that perhaps not everything that they're experiencing is the entirety of who they are. And that can be quite an uncomfortable thing. And alongside it, there's a questioning of one's personal ideas and constructs they have about themselves. They're becoming aware that their map is a map, and it might not give them a full insight into the terrain itself. And when this insight becomes a part of a person's awareness, that's when they can really get a lot out of therapy, when they have this relationship to themselves, this awareness that actually what I'm aware of might not be the full picture. I want to go and explore this a bit more, and that's where therapy can step in and be helpful. So in stage 1, they don't acknowledge that they have any feelings. In stage 2, they might acknowledge some feelings but not see any point in talking about them. In stage 3, they'll talk about feelings and ideas about themselves, but they'll see themselves as an object and possibly expect the therapist to turn them into a better object. Whilst in stage 4, there's some acknowledgement of the relational nature that they have with themselves. The fact that their ideas about themselves is not the full picture of who they are, and there's more to explore. On to stage 5, and by now you're probably getting some insight into the kind of things that are developing and changing as we go through the stages. Here then, the feelings can be expressed more spontaneously without being fully understood. We saw the development of this in stage 4, where some feelings could bubble up into awareness. Here, there's a greater trust that these feelings are valid, and so feelings will come up into awareness in the moment on a more regular basis. They might often, at this time, when expressing themselves in the moment and trying to understand things, get a vague feeling of talking around the crux of the issue. They might feel like they're getting close to something important, but not quite be able to arrive at the thing that they're trying to express, at the thing that they're trying to say. And there can be a real complexity in how they articulate the exploration of their inner world. For example, they can express and acknowledge a range of contradictory feelings about different issues and not need to resolve them by deciding on one of those feelings being valid and the other not. Perhaps all of those feelings are valid, but they're all there mixed up, and that complexity is acknowledged and worked with. And by this point, a person is, I think, becoming very aware of themselves and their terrain and so on. What they are also becoming aware of, though, is perhaps the gap between their real self and their genuine personhood, and how they portray themselves to the world around them. And they might want to explore around this point making changes to their life that acknowledge the genuine parts of themselves which perhaps they've not expressed previously. On to stage 6 now, and a person's doing pretty well at this point, to be honest. They can trust themselves really quite well. Feelings come up in the moment, whatever they are, they can process them and they can express them and feel them to their full result. The self-concept at this point begins to go away as a fixed entity. It's always in a state of change, as the person is always checking with their own experience in order to guide them, rather than abstract fixed ideas that they have about themselves. Ideas they have about themselves in the abstract don't really mean very much anymore, because it's the direct present experience which is the basis for the decision making. And this is quite a reliable way to go, because they're aware of so much of what's going on inside themselves and their feelings that they have a decent feedback loop. They are able to navigate themselves in whatever direction it is that feels most meaningful to them. It might not make sense in the moment, and yet they have that trust in their gut, in their feelings, to get them to a place that they want to be. Because feelings at this stage aren't seen as random. They are seen as your body's way of telling you what your needs are and what direction you need to go in. And this increase in trust in themselves and their feelings enables them to live in the moment a lot more. They don't need to rely on abstractions, whether it's abstract ideas about themselves, abstract ideas about issues at large in the world, or even abstract ideas about the past or the future. They can live in the present much more than they may have been able to previously. And these stages don't represent happiness, by the way. I need to make that clear. Stage 6, you can be really sad and upset or angry in stage 6 perhaps. What it means though is you've got enough of a feedback loop to be able to process your feelings and I guess eventually go about your day. Whereas in the lower stages, if something happens that makes you sad, angry, upset or whatever, you have less information about what's going on inside of you in order to process and resolve those feelings, and they're more likely to cause issues further down the line. In the higher stages, you can be any feeling you can think of. The only thing is you're more likely to be able to figure out a way forward. And finally, there's stage 7. Personally, I don't fully understand what the difference is between stage 6 and stage 7. I guess stage 7 is just a bit further on. There's more of a basic trust in a person's own process. They become even more process orientated with even less structure bound, abstract, fixed aspects of themselves. And any personal constructs that do get developed are very loosely formulated and checked constantly against experience. So the map is always checking in with the terrain and updating itself in light of it. I just want to say that Rogers, in a later book, this book on encounter groups, describes 6 stages. So make of that what you will. I don't think there's much of a difference between stage 6 and stage 7. Either way, I hope this has given you some indication of the continuum, even if you might want to take the separate stages with a pinch of salt. Hold them loosely, perhaps, like a true stage 6 or stage 7 person would.